7 seconds after it began, the room fell silent. Not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing else could. Those who were there say the challenge ended before anyone understood how it had started. The challenger stood still, unharmed, yet unmistakably finished. Bruce Lee did not celebrate. He adjusted his posture, looked once, and walked away. What mattered was not what he did, but what no one ever asked him to prove again. The building was unremarkable from the street. A narrow doorway, faded wooden panels, the faint smell of oil and sweat drifting out when the wind shifted. Inside, the room was smaller than most imagined. A rectangular expanse of polished wood surrounded by mirrors that had seen generations of hands, feet, and tempers. It was here that reputations were not earned by announcements or trophies, but by the quiet weight of presence. Witnesses who later recounted the event often began the same way. The air was heavy before anyone arrived. There was no music, no clatter of steel, only the soft, habitual rhythm of movement. Students practicing forms, instructors correcting posture with minimal words, eyes trained more on detail than display. In this space, the simplest misstep carried consequences. A poorly timed step, a hesitant hand, a foot placed too early, each became evidence, silently catalogued by those who understood. Bruce Lee entered like any other day. He wore no special attire, no symbol of rank beyond the way he carried himself. His movements were measured, economy of motion perfected over years, yet even in stillness they seemed to stretch time slightly. Those in the room noted the subtle shift. The space itself adjusted to his presence, as if the light bent around the certainty of him. Not arrogance, not challenge, mere authority, unspoken, absolute. The room held a particular order. Observers along the perimeter, students in neat rows, challengers or visiting masters near the center. Eyes were not aggressive. They were calculating. This was not a theater, and there was no audience for entertainment. Every motion, every glance was quietly observed, stored, and assessed. Even the air seemed to pause, as if waiting for something to emerge, some anomaly to disturb the rhythm of its habitual weight. Bruce's reputation had preceded him, but in this room, reputation alone did not carry the day. Masters who entered here understood that. They knew silence could hold more weight than words, that anticipation could unmask uncertainty faster than a misstep. It was the place where the world outside, full of chatter, speculation, and rumor, fell away, leaving only the unadorned measure of skill. By the time the challenger arrived, the room had already shifted subtly. Not in noise, but in the compression of attention, the quiet acknowledgement that something significant was about to unfold. This was the environment that shaped legends. Not grandeur, not spectacle, but a space where every second was a statement, every motion a proof. And in this room, Bruce Lee needed no demonstration to remind those present who had already earned their cautious respect. Even before the first step was taken toward the inevitable encounter, the room had spoken. Its silence had set the stakes, and the reputations inside were now subject to an unspoken trial. The weight of history, tradition, and expectation compressed the air. Every visitor, every student, every observer knew. This was the place where skill was distilled to its purest form. Nothing else mattered. The quiet momentum of the room was palpable. Bruce stood at the edge, watching, waiting, not for attention, but for the moment when inevitability would reveal itself. And in that stillness, the first signal of what was to come began to whisper. The challenger arrived with the measured confidence of someone used to being heard without raising their voice. He was not a brash fighter, nor a showman seeking notoriety. Every gesture was deliberate, every step precise, as if the room itself had dictated how he should move before he ever entered. Yet he carried more than personal ambition. He carried the weight of a tradition, a lineage of martial practice that had survived decades. defended by countless practitioners who believed in its primacy. Witnesses later recalled how he surveyed the room, not with challenge, but with calculation. His eyes traced the familiar patterns. Students lined up, instructors adjusting stances, subtle cues passing unnoticed by those unfamiliar with the craft. When they rested on Bruce, there was recognition. Not surprise, not dismissal, but acknowledgement of someone whose reputation had reached even the outer edges of established schools. In that brief, silent exchange, the unspoken question emerged. Would the new standard displace the old? He did not speak immediately. Words were unnecessary. The challenge itself was understood by all present. A single nod, slight, almost imperceptible, indicated his intent to test the authority that had drawn observers from across the city. To refuse would have been dishonorable. To accept would define more than skill, it would establish hierarchy, influence, and, ultimately, legacy. In those seconds before contact, tension did not build with noise. It compressed quietly, like air drawn into a narrow chamber. The challenger's preparation was subtle. Witnesses described a posture balanced between readiness and restraint, hands relaxed but eyes alert, feet aligned with precision honed through decades. There was no showmanship, no exhibition of strength. His body communicated one message only. He represented a lineage, and he would not falter on principle. It was a quiet defiance that carried the weight of many voices. Masters, students, and traditions that watched through him, invested in the outcome without moving a finger. Bruce observed without haste. There was no preemptive motion, no test strike, no overt display of skill. He treated the challenger as he treated the room, with measured awareness, patience, and absolute clarity. The dynamic between them was not one of hostility. It was one of inevitability. Every witness later noted that the air itself seemed to shift at this juncture. Not because of fear, but because the stage had been set and the audience, though still, could sense the quiet calculus of authority beginning to unfold. The psychological balance was clear. One man carried collective expectation. The other carried absolute mastery. The room, silent and patient, had become a crucible. The presence of so many observers amplified the tension, but never through sound, through awareness, through subtle micro-movements, through the recognition that the outcome, once determined, would not require explanation. In those moments, the challenger was no longer simply an individual. He was a vessel for every standard and expectation that had preceded him. Bruce Lee did not merely face him. He faced the weight of the tradition itself. And the witnesses, trained to notice nuance, felt the inevitability settle like dust in the air. Something was about to conclude, not with noise or spectacle, but with quiet clarity. The silence thickened, yet no action had yet begun. The crowd leaned forward in subtle anticipation, their awareness sharpened not by hype, but by the recognition that the moment had already begun. The stage was set. The demonstration would be almost imperceptible, and its consequences would ripple far beyond the walls of that small training room. By the time the observers noticed, the room had already grown smaller. Not in physical space, but in attention. Every student, every senior practitioner, every visiting master, each body seemed drawn slightly forward, leaning into a gravity that was not physical. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, yet unanimous. Witnesses later said they felt as if the room itself had leaned, compressing sound, weight, and expectation into a single, shared focus. There was no chatter, no audible excitement. The crowd did not murmur. They did not shift impatiently. Their presence was an instrument of observation, each individual a silent recorder of motion, balance, and reaction. Even the youngest students understood the significance. They had seen enough instruction to know that moments like this did not demand noise, only attention. The air was thick with anticipation, yet calm. It was the calm of people who knew that, in a few moments, understanding would arrive without spectacle. Witnesses described the crowd's attention as being almost physical in its intensity. Eyes tracked each micromovement. The way Bruce shifted weight subtly, how the challenger held his stance, even the small inhalations that betrayed readiness. Nothing was dramatic. No flourish, no exaggerated posture. Yet, in those subtle signals, everyone understood the stakes. Each observer was part of a shared cognition, a quiet agreement that the encounter would define authority, skill, and legacy. Some later remarked on the absence of typical response. There was no audible gasp, no movement forward to intervene, no cheering. The silence did not invite nervousness. It demanded clarity. It made the inevitability of the outcome, though not yet visible, palpable. Every second stretched, not because of action, but because of observation, the slow compression of attention waiting for a single, definitive measure of skill. Even as the challenger subtly adjusted, the crowd sensed that this was no ordinary challenge. The man before Bruce represented lineage and history, and yet, there was no fear, no overt challenge. Just an understanding. What was about to unfold was a demonstration in the purest sense. It would not rely on spectacle, on sound, or on brute display. It would rely on inevitability. The witnesses recalled the quietest detail of all. The room seemed to hush further when Bruce shifted his stance. It was so minor that it could have been missed, yet it was enough. The subtle realignment, the micro-adjustment, communicated control without motion, authority without aggression. In that instant, the audience knew something fundamental had changed. The crowd leaned forward not to intervene, not to witness entertainment, but to witness clarity. Their anticipation was not excitement, it was comprehension. The inevitable was about to occur, and even before it began, every observer understood that what would follow would leave no room for debate, no need for explanation. The room remained still, yet its awareness had crystallized. Every eye, every breath, every subtle shift was a testament to shared understanding. The stage was now complete, the psychological space defined, and the moment of silent demonstration was poised to unfold. What happened next is described consistently by witnesses, though each recalls it in fragments, because it was nearly invisible, almost imperceptible. The challenger stepped forward, posture intact, hands relaxed. There was no flourish, no threat, no attempt to impress. Bruce Lee responded in kind, not with force, but with presence. Time, as those present later said, seemed to slow, not because of drama, but because the measurement of skill had begun. Every micro-adjustment, every shift of weight, every glance was sufficient. Nothing more was required. No one remembers a blow landing. No one recalls a strike connecting. Yet, in the span of 7 seconds, it became clear that resistance was unnecessary. Witnesses describe a sudden, almost unconscious realization sweeping through the room. The challenger, despite his discipline and lineage, would not, and could not, overcome what he faced. It was not fear that stopped him. It was clarity. Bruce's demonstration was not in his hands or his feet. It was in timing, in placement, in the way he occupied space without aggression. Observers spoke of microdistances that seemed to collapse instinctively, a precision that required no impact. The effect was undeniable. In a matter of seconds, the outcome was decided without spectacle, without struggle. The room registered the result collectively, even if the senses had caught almost nothing tangible. The challenger's body remained upright. He did not fall. He did not concede verbally. Yet his stance shifted subtly, imperceptibly, like the tilt of a tree bending under weight it cannot oppose. The audience saw it, felt it, and understood the quiet mastery at work. The lesson was not taught, it was witnessed, absorbed through observation and instinct. Some later remarked that it was the absence of violence that defined the moment. There was no showmanship, no clash of strength, no dramatization of skill. Just the undeniable assertion of control. Bruce Lee's authority was not imposed. it was realized. The room, the challenger, the observers all registered a new equilibrium, and it required no further demonstration. In that 7-second span, the demonstration ended as quietly as it began. No applause, no gasp, no exclamation. The inevitability had concluded, leaving a dense, silent comprehension hanging in the air. It was the kind of clarity that lingered longer than noise ever could, marking both the challenger and the witnesses in ways that words could never capture. Even years later, those present would describe that moment not in terms of what was done, but in terms of what became impossible afterward. Resistance, challenge, or doubt, each had quietly evaporated, leaving only recognition. The room remained still, the crowd unmoving, yet nothing would ever feel the same again. In the quiet aftermath, the authority of Bruce Lee was not announced. It was absorbed, internalized, undeniable. The demonstration without drama had ended, but its effect had begun. After those 7 seconds, the room seemed to exhale, though no one moved. The challenger remained standing, but something fundamental had shifted. Witnesses later described it not as defeat, not as submission, but as a sudden, unspoken acknowledgement. The measure of mastery had been revealed, and it could not be contested. The challenger's eyes no longer searched for openings or flaws. His body, once deliberate and precise, now carried the subtle relaxation of inevitability. Every step he had rehearsed in preparation was rendered unnecessary. Those observing sensed it immediately, a collapse not of pride, not of spirit, but of certainty itself. The foundation upon which he had tested himself was no longer present. The crowd did not react with noise or gesture. They could not. The silence was deeper than ordinary stillness. It was an imprint of comprehension. Every witness carried the quiet momentum of understanding, as if the room had collectively recognized that debate or argument was impossible. The challenge had not ended with a strike or a declaration. It had ended with acknowledgement, absorption, and the undeniable presence of authority. Bruce Lee adjusted slightly, a minimal movement, almost imperceptible, and stepped back. He did not speak, did not offer instruction. The lesson had been delivered without sound, without embellishment. Observers later remarked that the challenger's subtle bow, a brief nod, was the only acknowledgement required, a gesture of recognition that mastery had been observed and could not be denied. The silence stretched longer than the encounter itself. Witnesses recall the subtle shifts of the room. A student's hand leaving its practice position, a senior master leaning back slightly, all as if the world itself had momentarily paused to register the outcome. The air was no longer expectant. It was reflective, carrying the weight of understanding without commentary. In that moment, the challenge ceased to be a test of skill or lineage. It became a measure of perception, of the quiet authority that renders resistance unnecessary. The room had been a crucible, the crowd a witness, and the challenger a vessel for collective expectation. And in the stillness that followed, everyone present knew something had changed, forever and quietly, without a single blow exchanged. Years later, those who were present would describe this scene as the point when Bruce Lee's mastery transcended competition. The event was no longer a story of victory or defeat. It was a demonstration that authority, clarity, and precision could command reality without spectacle. And it was in this absence of drama that the legend began to settle, imperceptibly but irrevocably, into history. The room remained silent, the challenger composed yet irrevocably altered, and the witnesses carried a quiet comprehension that would echo far beyond that small space. Momentum had shifted not with action but with observation, and it would continue to shape perceptions for decades. Long after the room emptied, long after the visitors dispersed and the students returned to their routines, the story endured. Not in photographs, not in newspapers, not in recordings or accolades, there were none. It endured in memory, retold quietly, with precision, by those who had seen it, by those who had felt it. Every retelling carried the same cadence, measured, calm, and unmistakable. Witnesses spoke of the moment as a turning point. The challenger, once certain of the strength of lineage, would never speak of that encounter with the same pride. But neither did he speak of shame. Instead, he carried the understanding that mastery could exist in ways words could never capture. He returned to his practice, but his approach shifted. Subtlety over display, precision over volume, clarity over repetition. And those around him noticed. The room itself seemed unchanged, yet the air it contained had been altered. Students who had witnessed the event returned to their routines with a new sense of possibility, a quiet comprehension that mastery was not always loud, and authority was not always force. Conversations spoke less of winning and more of understanding. Challenges, when issued, were measured not in spectacle but in clarity. Years later, the tale became legend precisely because it resisted embellishment. Masters who had been skeptical found themselves repeating the story in hushed tones, not to glorify Bruce Lee, but to communicate the shape of authority, the depth of control, and the weight of precision. Those who had never been in the room felt its influence through indirect channels. Shifts in teaching methods, the quiet respect of students, the awareness that mastery could be observed rather than proclaimed. The challenger's legacy, too, was quietly transformed. He continued his practice, continued to instruct, continued to represent his lineage, but always with an awareness that clarity, timing, and observation could outweigh strength, experience, and tradition. He became a witness, and his story of encountering the inevitability of skill spread carefully, never exaggerated, always precise. For Bruce Lee, the event required no documentation, no demonstration, no retelling by his own hand. Its impact was evident in the way students, peers, and even rivals spoke of him afterward, not as a man who won fights, but as a man whose mastery shaped understanding. The story persisted in fragments. A glance, a gesture, a posture, a subtle shift in the air. Each observer became a custodian of the lesson, carrying it forward quietly, without fanfare, without need of proof. Decades later, the tale remained anchored in observation, in recollection, in the way small moments can define much larger truths. It became less about Bruce Lee, less about the challenger, and more about the principle that skill, when fully realized, needs no audience. It exists, it influences, it endures, and in that enduring silence, the legend took root. Not in dramatic demonstration, not in force, not in spectacle, but in the quiet, authoritative truth that mastery leaves its mark without asking for recognition. The room, the crowd, the challenger, and Bruce Lee all vanished into history. Only the lesson remained, and it continues imperceptibly in the way every observer perceives control, presence, and inevitability.